Okay, so first of all, some unfinished business from last time. I want to, the issue with Ham, like you were saying that it's unclear what's going on there with Ham revealing his father's privates. Like what is going on there? Um, so so for us, it's a question like, what is the sin here? Is it merely dishonoring the father by disrobing him, um, or is it a euphemism for something worse? And again, it seemed to me that it's a euphemism, but it seemed unclear. But so I looked it up. I looked up other places where that phrase appears.
The uncovering, or the covering up.
Uncovering the nakedness, and it clearly refers to a sexual act. So if you turn to Leviticus 18, yeah. So verse 3 on. So yeah, the first few verses is God spoke to Moses and Moses spoke to the people. But from verse 3 on, you'll see it just goes on and on and on about revealing the nakedness of this person, of that person. Okay? And it starts with, you shall not copy the practices of the Egyptians among whom you dwelt, or of the Canaanites among which you're going to go, to enter. So don't follow their practices, don't follow their laws, and then it just goes on and on about various kinds of incest. Okay? None of you shall come near anyone of his own flesh to uncover their nakedness, because I am God. Do not cover the nakedness of your mother. Do not cover the nakedness of your father's wife. Do not uncover the nakedness of this person, of that person, etc., etc., etc. Endless.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's clearly a euphemism, or maybe just this is how they. Because look, it's kind of like how when we say he slept with her, obviously, like we understand it as he had sex with her. Okay. But the words themselves merely say he slept with her. That's not a sexual act. Okay, so it might be that the Bible is being uh, coy, but it might be that this is just how they talked at the time, and it was clear to them. But whether it's coy or whether this was the ancient way of saying had sex with, Leviticus 18 clarifies that what Ham did to Noah was a sexual act. Okay, and the Bible sees this sin as a moral contaminant. Okay? Ham's sin runs through that genealogical line's gene pool. Okay, so the Canaanites come from that rotten line of that ancestral son. Okay, and when we started, 2 weeks ago, we mentioned Lot's daughters having sex with their father. If you, you remember it, but it's in Genesis 19. And what's common to the Lot story and to the Ham story is that in both of them, or both stories are clearly, purposefully by the author, a genealogical story. Okay? So the point about telling about Ham's sin towards Noah is to tell us, remember last week we talked about how almost every time, the author mentions Ham, say, Ham, the father of Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
Ham, the father of Canaan. Okay? So the point of the story is that this is the father of Canaan. Okay? The ancestral father of the Israelites' mortal enemies. Okay? So the point of telling us the same thing if you look at the Lot story. Actually, take a look. It's in Genesis 19, and you don't need to read the whole to look at the whole thing, but just there it is. If you scroll to the end, to 37. Where is it? 30.
So I have 37. The older one bore a son and named him Moab.
Yeah, 37,
Father of
38.
Moabites.
Yeah. So the older, so it talks, the previous verses talks about them getting drunk, having sex with him, and everything else. And the point of the whole story is to tell us that act produced the Moabites and the Ammonites. Okay, these two neighboring peoples who are going to make the Israelites' life, a living hell. Throughout the book of Joshua and Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Okay, so again, two enemies of the Israelites. The Ammonites and the Moabites are not mortal enemies because they're cousins of the Israelites, but again, the whole point is to tack on or to tell us who the Moabites come from, or what act the Moabites come from, and the Ammonites. And earlier in the Noah story, clarifying to us who these Canaanites are. Like they're rotten from time immemorial.
It is really interesting that all of the adversaries of Israel come from incest and from drunken incest.
Yeah, good point. Although not all, because look, the Philistines,
not the Philistines and not the Babylonians,
and but the Babylonians are not, like, they're not from here,
Right.
But there's
not north.
the Amalekites. We don't. At least I'm not aware of their genealogy or ancestral past.
Well, the Amalekites aren't they connected to that Genesis 6:1 through 6:4? Like, there's giants there.
Well, look, it says giants, but we can't look that verse with the sons of God coming, and I hesitate to make any connection between that and anything, simply because we know nothing about. Nobody can understand what that means. At least I haven't. I've read a few commentaries, and they're all so speculative and some are historical rather than kind of theological or biblical. But not to mention the fact that they're all washed away in the flood anyways. Okay, like humanity has descended from Noah, so whatever happened beforehand. Right, that the sons of God.
It does, but it does say that they were around then and later too, and this is right before right before the flood story. So it would stand to reason that something survived the flood that was not human.
Wait, where does it say that they existed afterwards as well?
6:4. They were around then and later too.
Just a second. 6.
It was then and later too that the Nephilim appeared on earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so look, it says, and God said, da, 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 da. So God limited people's lives to 120 years. The giants or the Nephilites. By the way, can you hear me okay? I hear this kind of echo.
No, I can hear you okay.
Okay. Were in the on the face of the earth in those days, and later as well. For the sons of God came to the yeah. So look, later as well, but it doesn't necessarily say. It doesn't necessarily mean after the flood, because look, we're told explicitly that everything died in the flood. Okay, so like we don't know how long, how much time passed between the time when God limited human life to 120 years and the flood. Could be, again, it doesn't say. Actually, the only thing we do know is that actually Noah and his sons were already alive. Because that happens at the end of the previous in Genesis 5:32.
Right. So it's this weird thing that interrupts everything, and then
And again,
this weird phrase.
I'm sure it means something. It's just that I don't understand it, and nobody I've read understands it. So that I'm loath to make any sort of conjecture based on that. Sons of God having sex with earth women.
The weird commonality, though, is it goes to a genealogy, like we're talking about in the context of Lot and of Noah.
Yeah. So clearly, it just like the positive. Look, all genealogies are, like I said, there's a lot of competition to get into this book. If it's in here, it has some purpose. Okay, it's not. There's no wasted pages here. And so the genealogies that we all skipped past had some sort of message that I'm assuming that those ancient people understood better than we do. But even if they didn't, doesn't matter. The point is that the author had a certain purpose in detailing all the begats and begats and begats. Okay? And again, I think it's meant to show relationships. Okay, so look again. I go back to the Hatfields and the McCoys. There's a purpose in us in family reunions, telling the younger generation and reminding ourselves about what great Grandpappy McCoy did to our grandmother at the creek. Okay? And look. I mentioned in this context Northern Ireland. They're still having parades for William III, with the orange flags and everything else. Now, today, I mean, not today, but once a year on the anniversary of the Battle of the Boyne, the Catholics remember it and the Protestants remember it in order to make it a live issue for people today. This thing that happened that you only know about from stories, we want to make it still relevant to you today so that you will get your identity, who you belong to and who you belong against. That's the nature of feuds. So I think in the context of the feud between the Israelites and the Canaanites and the Israelites and the Moabites and the Ammonites, etc., this is one of these stories, okay, about where these people come from. Why are they such scoundrels? Because they come from a long line of scoundrels. It's who they are. It's who they have always been. Okay, so let's get to Abraham. So the most famous episodes in the Bible, I forget the Bible. The most famous episodes in all of history, all of literature, are Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, the Exodus, and the binding of Isaac. And the binding of Isaac is in this pantheon for good reason, because it's such an eye-popping story. Okay? Eye-popping either because of how cruel and capricious God is, and how monstrous Abraham is, or eye-popping because what a wise shepherd God is and how good Abraham is. Okay, so the story has been interpreted in these two extremes and everywhere in between on that spectrum. But the point is that whichever way you read the story, whichever way you understand it, you're amazed by its two leading characters, by God and Abraham. So I wrote to you in the email last week that the Binding of Isaac episode seems to tell Jewish audiences, on the face of it, that, hey, your God is petty and cruel and needy, And your ancestral father and the founder of this group, these Israelites, was slavish and monstrous. Okay? And what Borgman, what I wrote in the email about Borgman is that what Borgman points out is that that is a misunderstanding of the biblical author. Okay? This message that God is capricious and cruel and that Abraham is a slavish monster, if that's the message you receive, it's because you haven't caught on to what the author is trying to convey. Okay, it's a misunderstanding of the biblical author because we cannot, because of the way we read the Bible. Okay? We cannot expect to understand this episode in the Abraham story. Yeah, so this is the climax of the Abraham story. And we can't expect to understand it if that's all we read. Okay, just like, look, we all understand that you can't skip the first 80 minutes of a movie, watch only the final scene, and then act like you understand what's going on in the movie. Okay, so we understand that if we chop in a movie, if we chop the director's holistic, sophisticated, kind of integrated movie, you know, into a 5-minute clip on YouTube, then you're look, when we clip a movie or when we clip a book to make, do you remember those Reader's Digest abridged versions of great novels? So instead of reading War and Peace, you're reading it in, like, I don't know, 90 pages or something.
Spark Notes.
Yeah. So again, if you take a drama like this in a novel or in a movie and chop it down into more digestible bits, again, either 5-minute clips on YouTube or these abridged notes of a great novel, and then you skip past the clips or the frames that you think are extraneous or redundant, and just jump ahead to the final clip or to where the action is, we understand that we are going to, in all likelihood, miss the director's message. We'll misunderstand that final scene if we don't progress the way that the author has led us by the hand. So that's Borgman's contention, okay? That if we read the Binding of Isaac story as this scene about a monstrous God and a monstrous father, you're misreading it. So what proof does Borgman need to produce to make you buy this explanation about the Binding of Isaac?
I think we touched on this earlier in our conversations, but how old is Isaac during the Binding of Isaac? Like, if he's in his 30s, it's different than if he's in his, like, pre-teens.
So he's somewhere between, I think, 16.
I think he's described as a Na'ar, which I think can range.
Yeah, it's not just the description, because the description, with Ishmael, sometimes he's described as a Nile, sometimes as a boy. You can't go by that, but there are chronological elements in the story. You know, that Abraham was this age here, and when Ishmael was banished, he was that age, and here he's this age. So it gives us a range, I think, Isaac is between the age of, I think, 13, maybe 11, and 37.
Yeah, 37.
Somewhere between there. You know, but either way,
it's a big difference between 37 and 11.
It is, yeah. Actually, I think it might be 16 and 37. But yeah, and if you split it down the middle, then clearly he's a grown man. But even if he's just a teenager, he's not. The point is, he's not a child. Okay, he's a
It's not a yeller.
Yeah. So so again, so if what would so again, Borgman says that the author has this whole plan here, and he's walking you stage by stage, and that process changes the way that we should understand the final, the climactic scene of the sacrifice. So, what would you need to see in the story to convince you that Borgman's theory or explanation has, holds water?
I think a big part is Isaac's understanding of what's happening, which we've talked about, like when he notices the knife and he continues to go up with his father, like what he, from his point, it isn't a cheap trick and pulled at him or pulled on him at the last second.
But why would that make God any less monstrous or cruel, or make Abraham any less horrible as a father?
So I guess it would be Isaac's self-sacrifice is different than Isaac being unaware and not choosing to put himself at the mercy of his father or of his God.
Look, but even if Isaac is self-sacrificing, it still means that God
asked for it,
demands it, and that Abraham, the father, is willing to do it. Okay, so I mean, it just makes Isaac more of a saint, but it doesn't make God or Abraham less of a villain. But look, it's not so much about it's not about the story itself. Because look, Borgman is saying this is not a shallow story. Okay, this happened. Look at these. These are the events. Draw conclusions about the characters from the events. Okay, Borgman is saying this is a very layered, kind of sophisticated novel. Okay, and if you see all these layers, then you'll understand the final scene very differently. Okay, so the point is that for us to accept Borgman's explanation that, hey, you're misreading this thing completely, God isn't cruel, Abraham isn't a monster, we would need to see proof that this story, these 12 chapters that we read, are actually not a simple kind of narrative, just an account of this happened and this happened and this happened, but rather that you have this literary masterpiece with these different layers and nuanced character development throughout the story. Because basically, what Borgman is saying is that if you think that you can understand Abraham, who you were introduced to in chapter 12, 11, is the same person you see at the binding of Isaac, then you've missed what happened. Okay, so for us to accept that Borgman is correct and that we've just been blind because we've been chopping this text and reading it, again, one chapter per week in the synagogue, or even less than that in Bible studies or whatever else, we would need to see evidence that this really is a sophisticated novel. These 12 chapters are very sophisticated, and that the author uses various literary tools to guide us through some sort of transformation in the God-Abraham relationship, or in Abraham's character, or in God's character. Okay, so we need to see that, hey, Borgman is right. When you read this thing in one fell swoop and kind of follow along, you see that this isn't a simple narrative. It's got this great depth and character development. Okay, so that's what we need to. Yeah. And if Borgman is wrong, if we don't see evidence that the earlier episodes of the Abraham story cast the final scene in a completely different light, then, so if Borgman is wrong, okay, if we don't see this kind of sophisticated growth thing, then what other explanation can we draw to explain the message that this episode sent Israelite audiences about a cruel and capricious and needy God and a psycho as the ancestral father of us all, of the Israelites. Okay, so if Borgman is wrong, okay, and if this really is a straightforward story that indicates that our God, again, this is Israelites in, let's say, 1000 BC, our God is cruel and capricious, and our founding father was a psycho. Okay, so how can we explain it? Again, if we dismiss Borgman, okay, this is not a layered story. There isn't any other way to kind of put lipstick on this pig. So how can we explain this story in a way that would make sense?
Wasn't there an alternative that perhaps Abraham was mistaken? Because the names to describe the biblical God keep on changing, from Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh to Elohim to, and then we have this messenger angel.
And
So perhaps because of that ambiguity, you could perhaps Abraham was not listening to the biblical God, but some other Elohim.
But that would be tough because the narrator tells us that God told him.
Why does the narrator change up the names? Why isn't it consistent?
Well, look. So we in our first meeting we talked about this because this is one of the theses of the documentary hypothesis that suggests that these are different religious traditions, different, perhaps even different gods, which, if all the other problems of the documentary hypothesis were solved, then okay, we can go with the documentary hypothesis explanation for this. Given that the documentary hypothesis has so many other problems, mostly the fact that even if it's true, it doesn't solve the problem that it introduces, because it still leaves an editor who left all these quote-unquote problems. But, so look, you and I constantly use different appellations for people that we talk about. Like if you tell me a story about your mother, you're not going to say, my mother did this, my mother did this, my mother did this. You're going to have different, like at some point you're going to say, and so my dad says, hey, Rebecca, stop doing this. And you're going to have, if you describe what you and I are doing, sometimes you'll refer to me as Guy, sometimes as Professor Chet, sometimes as Chet, just for variety's sake. Okay? And then on top of that, as we discussed in the Ishmael story, that when I think it was our first or second week, the different characters refer to Ishmael in different ways. Okay? So it could just be variety for stylistic purposes, but it could be that the author is trying to convey something to us about the nature of the relationship. That Sarah calls Ishmael a certain way, but Hagar calls him another way, and Abraham calls him another way. So with God, the changing appellations for God, it might be that as God establishes a closer relationship, he reveals more of himself. Okay, so up until I think Moses, they didn't know him by the name YHVH.
I think like Abraham at one point in what we read today calls out to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh.
Oh, he does? Okay, so
And
so where does it say that up until that they did not know me by that name? I thought it was in the Moses thing.
it might be later, but
Yeah. But in any case, but certainly we do. But so yeah, so there's no indication from the author that, well, we know God by all these different names, by Elohim, by God, by Lord, and by the explicit name. And the author, the biblical author, who is, again, the biblical author is an all-knowing author, he tells us, God did demand this. Okay? So if I'm playing devil's advocate, because obviously I'm a Borgman knight. But if Borgman is wrong, and this really is a simple story about a capricious and cruel God and a monstrous ancestral father, the founder of this of this people, what's the solution? Again, put aside the possibility that this is a story that shows God in a good light and Abraham in a good light. If it shows them in a bad light, how can we, modern readers, explain this? It's certainly odd.
Does it have to be both of them in a bad light or both of them in a good light, or can it be Abraham in a bad light, God in a good light, or the vice versa? Is that, although I'm just trying to figure out the alternative.
How, again, if it's a simple story, can it be that God is...
Well, my suggestion was that Abraham misunderstood, like, the different appellations for the biblical God showed confusion in Abraham.
Well, but we're not confused. I mean, the narrator is telling us that Abraham didn't have it wrong, like that God really did tell him to do this. No?
It's weird that he tells him to do this and then takes it back. So I don't know if those are two, like, if there was a misunderstanding from the get-go and then a correction.
Yeah. Okay. So look, so that's one explanation. Okay, that God seems monstrous, but that's because Abraham misunderstood. Okay, so God isn't actually cruel and capricious. It's just that Abraham misunderstood, and Abraham is a monstrous father because he was willing to do it. Okay, so that's one explanation. Okay. What other? I'm not asking what do you think, but what are the options? How can people, readers today, make? Because it doesn't make sense. Well, actually, maybe it does. Okay, so what other explanations are there for this odd story?
There's another explanation that from a God's eye view, individuals may not matter as much as the overarching story, and that for whatever reason this was necessary for the overarching providence that is going to happen. Yes. I mean, there's the God is mysterious, we can't understand his ways.
Yeah. But again, you're right. That we don't understand divine justice, as we've already established with the Cain story and Job. So we don't know. Okay, but it doesn't undo the impression. Okay, it just kind of, you're not competent to judge. The impression is terrible, but we must reserve judgment because we can't understand. So again, that doesn't solve the problem, but it removes the problem, or tells us to stop thinking about it. Look, the documentary hypothesis offers an explanation. Okay, so that there was a sloppy author or editor who meant to show God and Abraham in a positive light, but wound up doing the opposite. Okay, that again, these are different, you have here different traditions, and again, the name of God is different. And so all these different stories about Abraham were woven together, and the end result serves them both in a bad light. Okay, so that actually it doesn't even, forget the documentary hypothesis, but that the author / editor meant to show God and Abraham in a positive light, but carelessly wound up doing the opposite. Doesn't make sense, but that's an explanation. Another explanation is that maybe our sensibilities are screwed up. Okay? Maybe Israelites back then had different sensibilities and thought that these were good and admirable qualities in a God and in a man. Okay? That what we see as cruel and capricious in God and monstrous in Abraham the father, different cultures value and admire different things. Okay, so maybe they thought that this kind of God that's a positive attribute of a God, being capricious and demanding and cruel. The point is that this theory, too, just like the Borgman theory or the Borgman explanation, needs to produce evidence for us to buy it. This theory also needs actual evidence to make us believe it. Okay, so if it's a sloppy author, we need to see the sloppiness elsewhere. And for the most part, this is considered a great literary work for a reason. We don't see this author as a sloppy or as an author who inadvertently conveys something he doesn't want to convey. And if we're expected to buy the second explanation, the Jews back there had a different sensibility about what is an admirable quality in a God or in a person, then again we'll need to see that understanding of God or of humans in other parts of the Bible. Okay, we need to see other parts of the Bible celebrating God as cruel or capricious or petty or needy.
It seems in other parts of the Bible, child sacrifice is not looked up upon. It's looked down upon.
It's explicitly forbidden and seen as monstrous. Okay? But the point is that for us to buy the explanation about, well, that's a different culture and they had a different sensibility about God and people, for us to buy that, we would have to find other parts of the Bible in which the author praises God for or highlights God's cruelty or capriciousness as a good thing, and we'll need to see we'll need to see Israelite heroes who are slavish and monstrous like Abraham, for us to believe that, okay, Israelites back then had different understanding, and that's why they read this Abraham story in a positive light, whereas we, because we have different sensibilities, read it in a negative light. Okay, so I say this just because I don't want to lead us down the path that Borgman traces, that we have here a holistic, integrated literary work created by a thoughtful literary craftsman, as if it's the only path. My point is that if you reject the Borgman path, you'll have to follow one of these different paths, which will require you to do some heavy lifting in terms of finding evidence to support them, these other explanations. Okay, so and I think it's easier. I think it's easier to find evidence to support the Borgman thesis than to support these alternate theses. Okay, so
I agree. I don't understand how an editor would put this story together and not see that this is a big problem.
Yeah, and again, I think you'd be hard pressed. I agree that's just a silly thing, but the idea that the Jews read this story differently. Ancient Jews read this differently than we do in terms of values. You know, again, we just don't see elsewhere in the Bible God being kind of celebrated as cruel, as capricious, and we don't see, this scene with Abraham. Is seen as problematic, okay, in the Abraham story, and we don't see other episodes where fathers behave this way and are praised for it, and that it's a positive thing. Okay, it's a negative thing elsewhere in the Bible. Okay, so just if this story is part of the Bible, then we expect it to conform to the sensibilities displayed or presented elsewhere in the Bible.
And especially since this is Father Abraham, like this is the first patriarch.
Yeah, again, just like with the father of Canaan, okay, that we assume that something in the character of this ancestral father describes all of us, his descendants. We who are reading it today at, let's say, 1000 BC. Okay, so we're actually, I'm not sure. As I was saying it, I kind of take it back, because when we read stories later on, especially of Jacob and the 12 brothers, a lot of negative character traits. So I don't know. I erase what I said. It is Dennis Prager says that he sees the fact that the characters of the Bible, the Jewish characters, the Israelite characters, are so bad. They're so not admirable. They're not heroic. He says that's, to him, one of the strong pieces of evidence that it conveys some sort of historical truth. That these people were real, because what other people will tell stories about their ancestors? Would invent mythical stories about their ancestors and make them so negative, so not make these characters, these ancestral fathers and mothers, so uninspiring. Okay, so, but in any case, so let's study this story, study the Abraham-God relationship from the, again, as Borgman tells us to, just follow the story and try to see these layers in the story. So we're going to start with the first meeting, all the way to that climactic scene at Mount Moriah with Isaac.
So for Terah, though, why did Terah leave Ur?
So that is actually a very contentious debate that again, going back to the documentary hypothesis, hypothesists point to the Terach story, Abraham's father leaving with his family and towards Canaan, and as a piece of evidence for different narratives being woven together. Actually, I'll write to you after this. I'll lay out the argument that the documentary hypothesists make of the Terach story, and the mathematical response. You can find a solution to the problem that the documentary hypothesists raise. You can find in the story itself. But why do you ask about this? I don't want to, it's kind of an interesting
no, I understand.
thing, but what's the problem that it presents to you?
Is that if we're trying to understand Abraham, and we understand fathers and sons, like Abraham has to look to his father for something, and his father initiated the movement away from Ur.
Yeah.
And so, what did Abraham understand from that, and what did Abraham understand from the biblical God? From this, there just seems to be a lot of relationships in this story.
Right. So look, without getting into the, because again, there's a just a year count, which I'll send it to you on email so you can see it. The explanation from within the text as to what happens, what Terach, the father, was doing, and what Abraham was doing, okay? And when it is that Abraham was called upon to leave his father's house. But whichever it is, so whether it is a confusion on the part of the editor, as the documentary hypothesists argue, or whether there is a internally consistent story that makes sense in terms of the chronology, one way or the other, it's clear that God introduces himself to Abraham and tells him to leave his father, to leave his father's household, to forgo everything that he got at birth from his father. Okay? Family, the family itself, land, possession, the family honor, the kind of reputation of being part of Terach's family, the protection that a family offers. Okay, so God tells him, leave your father and go to the place where I will show you. And in exchange for this tremendous sacrifice and uncertainty, God promises that he, God, will provide Abraham with all these things. Yeah? So everything that Abraham is asked to give up by leaving his father, God promises to give him.
Wouldn't that be emphasized, that line be emphasized more if Abraham just left Ur? Like, why does he have to leave from Haran? Like, why does his father initiate the movement to Haran? And then, like, it seems like it would be more emphasized if it was his, like, ancestral land in Ur.
Yes. Yeah, look, we don't understand. So one explanation is that when Abraham was called to leave, the whole family left with him and then got stuck in Haran. Okay. Another explanation is that the family moved from Ur to Haran. Okay. And at that point, God gave this instruction. Okay, so look, it might reveal some sort of, again, oral history about where we came from. Okay, that we came from Haran. Okay, and again, I'm not trying to claim that this is a literal historical truth, but clearly the Israelites saw their family connection. So maybe we come from Ur, that's our origin, but our family is in Haran, and that's why when Abraham needs to find a wife for Isaac, he doesn't go to Ur, he goes to Haran. And the same goes for Jacob. When he escapes, he goes to Haran. That's where my family is. Okay, so it might simply reflect the kind of a people who understand their ancient origin place is in Ur, but we came here from Haran. And so this ancestral story tells the story of the family's migration from here to here to here, to Canaan. Okay, so it might simply reflect a collective memory about where we are. Look, if it's purely a literary invention, then you're right. And then you're right to ask, why introduce this wrinkle of Haran in the first place? Why not just have him come from Ur? But this is part literature, part communal history. as we saw with the genealogies. Okay, there's a need to explain and to tell where we came from. And if there's this collective memory that we came from Haran, then that's where the question should be then, your question should be,
Yeah, why did he go back to Ur?
well, yeah, why start the story at Ur?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's again. So, but again, maybe it's just again to start the story where it began. Okay, so kind of like how you would tell this your family story, as well. My great grandfather and grandmother were born in the Ukraine, and they moved to Ohio in 1783, and then the whole story of our family in America. Okay, so it's it's kind of like our family spread throughout, from Texas to California, from Ohio. Okay, that's the ancestral kind of place that we hail from. Okay, but there's a prehistory to our family, and that's in the Ukraine. Because it's to understand, where we're from. Okay, we're Ukrainians by origin. We're Urites by origin, even though our family is in Haran.
But it's still telling that I have an ancestor that wanted to leave.
Leave Ur.
Leave Ur.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, which is what I don't
Yeah.
understand why Terah wanted
Yeah,
to
look,
leave.
it seems that Terach's journey is, economical, for whatever reason people move. Whereas Abraham's journey is some sort of I don't want to say spiritual, but something else, as we'll discuss now. But it's submission to a divine command, or it's a deal with God. Okay. But again, I think you're right. You're right to ask the question: why start with Ur? It seems that the important thing is Haran. That's where the family is, and that's where Abraham leaves them. Okay, but it might simply be to tell the Israelites where you come from.
And in Haran, they don't have the ancestral lineage. Like in Haran, they're new.
Yeah.
Which is different than starting things in Ur.
Yeah, but look, Haran was, so we know that Haran was a kind of a commercial, it's in Mesopotamia, very fertile area, very rich area, and a commercial center. So, and we see this also in the future generations with Isaac and Jacob, that family is doing well there in Haran. So Terach did well there, and look, the family, even a poor family, even a Bedouin family in the desert, offers its members protection, a name, relationship with other families, so you can marry, etc., etc. Not to mention whatever possessions the family has. Okay, they're not homeless. Okay, clearly they have possessions. But in any case, so God he tells Abram, to leave, to forego everything that his father can offer him, and God promises that he'll provide all these things to him. Okay? And by the end of the story, we see that God came through. Okay? Because we see Abraham with a family of his own, with land of his own, with wealth, with honor and protection. Okay? All of the things that he sacrificed by leaving his father's house. Okay? So again, at the end of the story, everything worked out. You gave up let's say a fortune over there because God promised you that he'll give you a fortune in the future, and God came through, and great, everything's fine. Okay? But imagine listening to this story without knowing the end. Okay? What would you think of Abraham if you were a complete foreigner to this whole Judeo-Christian tradition? If you were reading this for the first time, not knowing that this person is the first Jew. And
He's
not
nuts.
Pardon?
He's nuts.
Exactly. Okay? The guy's delusional. He hears a voice in his head that tells him to do this crazy thing. Give up everything you have coming to you, and go to some far-off place where this voice will give you things that your father would provide you otherwise without a leap of faith. Again, family, home, land, possessions, protection, a good name, honor, respect. So again, if you nuts is right. If you think of the conversations that Abram had with friends and family and neighbors at the time, or had with his wife. Okay. So Abram, I hear you're leaving your family and going solo. Why? Why are you doing this? Oh, this voice in my head told me to do so. By the way, he said he was God. A God that I'd never heard of before, that nobody's ever heard of before. And he said that if I do what he tells me, then he'll give me a family and a home and wealth, and that he'll protect me, etc. Okay, weirdo. Okay. So yeah, it's a. Oh, and look, just as a brief aside, let me prove to you that you're not the only one who came up with this "he's nuts" reaction. That you and I aren't making a mountain out of a molehill here. That it is a concern about whether Abraham is delusional. Okay, that this is this issue of is Abraham crazy is a real issue in this story. So if you can jump to Genesis 24. Genesis 24. The very beginning, the first 7 or 8 verses.
Abram was now old and advanced in years, and the Lord blessed Abram in all things.
Yes. So so actually, read it out loud.
Yeah, and Abram said to the senior servant of his household, who had charged you of all that he owned, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to the land of my birth and get a wife for my son Isaac. And the servant said to him, what if the woman does not consent to follow me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the land from which you came? Abram answered him, on no account must you take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my native land, who promised me on oath, saying, I will assign the land to your offspring. He will send his angel before you, and you will get a wife for my son from there.
Great. And if she the 8th verse 8, and if she isn't willing to come after you and come back here, then you're absolved from your oath, and just be sure not to take my son there. Okay. So now, if so, he sends what's his name? The slave Eliezer is the servant's name. Okay, so he sends Eliezer to Haran to find a wife for Isaac, and this scene that you just read is what he tells him to do. Okay, now if you go to where Eliezer actually, he's now there and he's meeting Rebekah's family. Okay, this is Abraham's clan in Haran, and he asks to take this Rebekah girl with him back to Canaan as a wife for Isaac, in verse 34 to 41. 24, 30.
I have it. I am Abram's servant, he began. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become rich. He has given him sheep and cattle and silver and gold, male and female slaves, camels and asses. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore my master a son in her old age, and he has assigned him everything he owns. Now my master made me swear, saying, you shall not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house, to my kindred, and get a wife for my son. And I said to my master, what if the woman does not follow me?
Okay, good. So, what do you notice when you compare Abraham's words to Eliezer? So this is...
Eliezer thinks he's nuts. Like, why would anyone come back here?
Well, but yeah, so look, if you compare what Abraham tells Eliezer to say, and what Eliezer says to Rebekah's father, Rebekah's brother, Lavan, right? So it's compare verse 6, and I guess verse 7. So Abraham, in verse 6, Abraham tells them, don't take my son there. And then he tells them, God, the Lord of the heavens, who took me from my father's house and from my my homeland, and who spoke to me and promised me that to you and your seed I will give this land. Where is it? Yeah. Give this land. He sends. Where is it? He sends his angel, his messenger, to you to take a wife from there. Now compare that to verse 40. Verse 40.
He replied to me, the Lord whose ways I have followed will send his angel.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Okay.
And make you.
So he told me. Okay. He told me, God, after whom I have, the God whom I have followed, sent his messenger to find a wife, etc. Okay. So what is the difference between, again, verse 7 and verse 40? Between what Abraham tells Eliezer to say and what Eliezer actually says?
Abraham said that an angel will already have appeared, and Eliezer takes it as, I was told that an angel already appeared.
No. Eliezer is the angel. So, we'll talk about it in a bit, but angel is simply a messenger. Okay, in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, and in ancient Greek, angel is simply a messenger. It's not a celestial being. But the where is it? 40. Okay. So this is in 40. He said to me, this is Abraham's said to me, God, the God whom I have followed, is sending his his messenger, and will make you succeed in finding a wife from my family. Okay? Compare that to verse 7, where again it says, he said to him, Abraham said to me, God, the God of the heavens, who took me from my father's land, who took me from my father's house, my father and my homeland, and who spoke to me and swore to me that to you I will give this land, etc., etc. Okay, so again, it starts with God, and it ends with sending a messenger to take a wife from Haran. But do you see the difference between 7 and 40?
God will send a messenger versus...
Well, no, in both God sends a messenger. But before then, God, what? In 7, God, the God of the heavens, who took me from my father's house, my homeland, and spoke to me and swore to me that I will give you all this land. Okay? All this is gone when Eliezer speaks to Lavan.
Okay, the Lord whose
Okay?
ways I have followed.
It's just God, and I followed this God, and that's it. Eliezer drops all the mumbo jumbo about Abraham talking to God, the God of the universe, not some sort of local God. Okay? So Abraham says, tell them that God, who took me from this and promised me all this and the other, Eliezer doesn't mention any of it. Okay?
So he abstracts the covenant.
Pardon?
He abstracts the covenant or the agreement between Abraham and God.
What do you mean?
He swore to me that he will do all these things for me, and then...
Yeah, but what do you mean abstracts the covenant?
He doesn't mention it. He takes it away.
Yeah.
Doesn't take it.
Obstruct.
Doesn't consider it.
I thought you said abstracts as an abstraction. But yeah, he eliminates it. Okay, all the religious stuff, all the stuff about Abraham's personal relationship with the God of the universe. I don't want to make my master sound like he's crazy, because my job is to convince this family to give their daughter to join Abraham's father. Okay, so everything about Abraham talking to God, about how Abraham left Haran because God told him to do so, and about God promising him a kingdom, okay, Eliezer drops all of that, and instead he misquotes Abraham by saying, the God before whom or after whom I've walked. Abraham doesn't say that. Abraham describes a close reciprocal relationship, a personal relationship with the God of the universe. Eliezer mentions none of it and just say, Abraham follows God. Okay? And he also adds stuff in 35 that about Abraham's great wealth that Abraham did not mention in his instructions to Eliezer. Okay, so it addresses exactly what you're saying about nuts. Okay, Eliezer is trying to get Lavan to get him interested in marrying his sister into Abraham's family. Okay, so if you're trying to sell Abraham as a good place for Lavan's sister to go to, a good alliance for Lavan to make with Abraham, Eliezer thinks it's probably a good idea to drop this whole thing about Abraham talking to God, so that he won't make Abraham sound like a crazy person. And so he eliminates the stuff that he thinks will make Lavan say, I don't want to enter into an alliance with a guy who thinks he's talking to God and who left his home because God promises to give him a new home. Yeah, and this God promised him a whole country. Okay? And instead, so he drops that and he adds stuff that would make his master, Abraham, sound more attractive. So he drops the stuff that makes Abraham seem less attractive and adds stuff that Abraham didn't tell him to say about wealth that makes his master seem more attractive as a marriage candidate. Okay? So the point is that it's not you who thinks that this is crazy, or that Abraham leaving his home is because God told him. It's not that this is not a perception problem on your part. Okay? The biblical author tells you that this is a loony story. Okay? Through Abraham's words, through Abraham's deeds, and here also. So throughout the Abraham story, the author will tell you that you're right. Okay? This is crazy. Okay? And that people I would say including Abraham, are wondering, is Abraham crazy? Okay, and you can see it in the story itself with Abraham's relationship with God, and you can see it in this little episode here at the end of the Abraham story. Okay. So if you heard this story about this Abram fellow for the first time without knowing the ending, you'd think, like you said, that he's some delusional, loony mystic. Okay? So that's at the beginning of the story. When in the story would you change your mind about him from being delusional to being a man who really does walk and talk with God? Like at what point of the story, again, if you're exposed to this for the first time, would you change your assessment of him as being nuts and develop a different assessment that, okay, this is legit?
I don't know if this is it. He was decent to Lot and letting Lot figure out where he wanted to settle. He was decent to the men who came to visit him when he was in the tent, and treated them well and demonstrated that his household was run well, and that he could and host them very well.
Yeah, but look, a lot of delusional people are perfectly decent. I mean, they're not axe murderers. I mean, some are, but some people who are not delusional are also axe murderers. The point is, if you're hearing God speaking to you, you might be delusional, or you might actually be hearing God speaking. You know, it might be that really God is speaking to you, or it might be that you're delusional. Okay. So my question is, when in the story, look, at some point in the story, we know that Abraham is not delusional, that he really is having a relationship with God. Okay? So at the beginning, we think nuts. At the end, we know he's not nuts, and he was not nuts. Okay? At what point of the story do you go from thinking that he's nuts to thinking that he's really having a relationship, a conversation with God?
So when God stops him from bringing down the knife on Isaac.
Why? Like,
because that's him not doing that seems rational.
So that well, but look, it's still, God didn't look. If we're thinking that Abraham's delusional, you know, might be delusional, then it might be that just again, if God tells me to murder my son, and as I'm about to drive the knife into my son's chest, I have second thoughts, or I'm struck by the horribleness of it, then again, if I'm delusional, and if I invented this God who's telling me to kill my son, here I'm inventing, or I'm putting words in God's mouth to prevent me from doing this horrible thing.
So after the moment, Isaac goes away, and then Sarah dies, and then he buys the burial plot.
Yeah, look, there's no more. I mean, that's the last time God and Abraham speak. There's no other. That's the last conversation they have.
Then it would seem that there's, if from the get-go you think that he's nuts with this conversation with God, it seems like he's nuts throughout.
Does it? I mean, to me, there's an obvious moment well before then,
that would, the covenant, like
Why?
when he's,
Why the
because he
covenant?
wants, I mean, there's a quid pro quo, like he's promised something.
Right, but couldn't it be that Abraham is again delusional, that he's seeing these things? You know, he's seeing this all these events and the smoke walking through these separated animals and everything else. Crazy people
When his, when
imagine
his,
things.
when Isaac is born,
Why?
that's strange because Sarah is so old, and it doesn't make sense that
Yeah,
Isaac would be born,
yeah,
especially after
yeah.
Ishmael was born. And
And I mean, it's not strange. It's insane. It's miraculous. It is against the laws of nature for a woman who's 90 years old and who's no longer fertile, who no longer has her period, which it says, it clarifies, she is no
no
longer
longer,
whatever in the ways of
it
women.
was the ways of woman or
Yeah.
something like that.
Okay. So that is clearly miraculous. Now, all the other things that happened to Abraham are also miraculous. A voice talking to you, visions, the covenant of the pieces, where the smoke and fire walking in the middle between the split animals. All of these things are miraculous, but they could be imaginary. Isaac is not imaginary.
Mm.
Isaac is a real boy born to a 90-year-old woman. Okay? Other people can see him. Okay? Ishmael can see him. Okay? So at that point, you know, the birth of Isaac clarifies to us, oh, this wasn't a delusion. A real boy. You know, God promised that this miracle would happen. And here, at the point where nobody could suspect that it might be natural, because look, if a 45-year-old woman, a 50-year-old woman has a child, it can happen. Rare. But 90? After she stops being, you know, in the ways of women, or whatever, you know, however it says, that is a miracle. It's a miracle that this quote-unquote delusion promised Abraham would happen. And here it happens, and it's a live boy who's alive. Other people can see him, touch him. A woman marries him a few years later. So that moment clarifies to us, that to us the readers, the first-time readers, okay, this guy that we thought might be delusional, turns out he's not delusional. So as we read the story, we need to keep in mind what an outlandish story this is, and that Abram's family and his friends and his acquaintances, probably his wife too, thought that he had lost his mind. Again, think of a tribal society that's hearing this story and thinking, some voice tells you to leave your father's house and just go solo. Again, going solo, you can do this in America, in the modern US, okay? But doing this in the ancient world, where there's no, what do you call it, safety net, again, the social security and these things, it's an act of suicide. Well, it's crazy. Okay? So they thought he lost his mind, that he was hearing voices, okay? That he was a mental patient. And of course, if everyone thinks this of you, you'd be wondering that yourself. Okay? Abram must know that they all think I'm crazy. Okay? Like when he left his family, like I'm sure he had an explanation. Okay? I'm going because some voice in my head told me to go to some land, and that, oh, by the way, he's going to give me that land. That's why I'm leaving home, family, wealth, protection, honor, etc. Okay? So everyone he spoke to, everyone who saw him leave, and again, probably also his wife, were wondering whether he's crazy. And if he knows that they think he's crazy, then there's no way that he wouldn't wonder that about himself. Could it be that I'm just hearing voices? Am I crazy? am I ruining my life, not to mention my wife's life, by obeying some voice in my head? Look, I'll put it to you. You know, if look, you have a home and a family, etc. If you heard a voice in your head telling you that he's God and commanding you to do something, okay, empty your bank account. David, I'm God. I want you to empty your bank account and give everything to the homeless. Everything you own. Sell your house, empty your bank account, give it to the homeless. I promise that I will make you rich again. Do it. Or jump off a bridge. I'll save you. Okay, what would you do if you heard a voice who identified himself as God to you?
I second guess my sanity.
Right.
For Abraham, what about those early wars when he was victorious?
Well, this is before that. Okay, this is just God telling him to leave. This is the first encounter. Yeah, this is before all the events in Canaan. Okay, so that when you hear somebody telling you he's God and do some sort of crazy thing like leaving your family or your family's house, the first thing to do, or empty your bank account, the first thing to do is to find out if you're crazy. Okay? If you're crazy, then you should definitely not do whatever this voice is telling you to do. And probably also check yourself into a mental institution. But if you investigate yourself and you find that, no, I'm not crazy, and this apparently really is God, in which case it would behoove you, it would be wise to do what the voice commands you to do and to trust that God really will make you rich again and save you and whatever else. Okay, so that's when you hear a voice telling you, I'm God, do this crazy thing for me, the first thing to do is to find out whether you're crazy. Okay? So how again, I'm given this scenario where God tells you to sell your house, give all your wealth to the homeless, how would you find out, how would you investigate whether you're crazy or whether this really is God?
Put it to the test.
Like what? What's the test? You're right. What's the test?
If things work out for you.
Well,
I guess on the first.
Well, I mean, you're going to jump off the bridge as a test? Or sell your house and give all your possessions as a test to see if you're crazy? That's in fact the evidence that you are crazy.
No, yeah. But would it be different for... He comes from Ur, which is polytheistic, and there are gods that are of different strengths. So even if he did believe it was a god, does he believe that that God is strong enough to come through?
Yeah, but let's say that he... look, we don't believe at what stage of monotheism he is. You know, does he know that this is the real God and all the other gods are mumbo jumbo, or does he think that this is just a very powerful God? But let's forget Abraham for a second. But you know, if we're saying that the first thing to do when you hear God talking to you and telling you to do something crazy is to find out whether you're insane, whether you're just hearing voices, or whether this voice really is God speaking to you. Okay, so you need to test whether you're hearing voices or whether this is God. So how do you test it?
I suppose you look for a sign of some sort.
Like what? Like what sign would convince you that this really is God? I mean, I really like it. Just, again, think of yourself. If God, if you heard this voice now, what would you do to find out whether this really is God?
I think at some point, like even if there was a sign or even if there were, like it's still like a weird leap of faith.
Right, but what would make it not a leap of faith? At what point will you be convinced okay, this really is God. And so therefore I should do it.
It would have to be an unequivocal miracle.
Right. Exactly. Okay? The test to find out whether this is God or whether this is some sort of crazy voice that I invented in my own head is to demand a miracle. Okay? Because if this is just a voice that I created in my own head, and I told him, and I told this voice, okay, if you're really God, turn this book into water right now. Okay? If I'm crazy, if I'm imagining things, I cannot turn this book into water. But God can. Okay, so what you'd say to the voice is, voice in my head, prove to me that you are God. You know, perform some sort of supernatural trick for me, that, again, unequivocal, something unequivocal. Then I will believe that I'm not crazy, that you're God, and I will do what you tell me. Okay, so keep this in mind as we read, that Abraham is doing something crazy. Everybody around him must think that he's crazy, and he must wonder if he's crazy. And that this is the test. Okay? I don't know if this is a voice in my head or if it's really God. And this is something that every religious person goes through repeatedly in life. Yeah, because everyone experiences terrible things that they don't think they deserve in this life. Again, we talked about Cain and Job, etc. Everyone sees bad people prosper and good people suffer, and babies tormented and die by disease and by violence and floods and everything else. Okay? And these things, when irreligious people see all these things, again, babies suffering and dying, and the evil prospering and the righteous suffering, etc., it does not shake the worldview of irreligious people, because they know that there's no good and benevolent and just God in the world. Okay? And therefore they don't expect the world to be good and benevolent and just. Okay? But religious people are perplexed when they witness theodicy and, well, yeah, again, bad things happening to good people and good things happening to bad people. Okay, and you can conduct a study on your own, of your own on this. Okay, just find religious and irreligious people that you know, and ask them about doubt. Okay? Ask religious people if, when they see these terrible things, okay, like a newborn baby consumed by terrible disease, or the Holocaust, or a friend or a loved one beaten to death on the street, ask them if it makes it more difficult for them to believe in God's existence. And then ask irreligious people if, when they see seemingly miraculous things, like somebody surviving a fall from a tall building, or, like in the cartoons, when you're walking down the street and a piano falls right next to you, and like an inch from you, and you walk away unscathed. If it makes them doubt their irreligion, does it make them wonder that maybe there is a God? Yeah, I've just gone through or I've just witnessed something that seems miraculous. Okay. The point is that the religious person, and I think, again, I think what you'll find is that irreligious people are not shaken in their faith that there's no God by seeing things that seem miraculous. They have natural explanations for it. But religious people are shaken in their faith in a good and just God is shaken when they see things that are not good, not just, etc. So with doubt, the point is that the religious person experiences repeated bouts of doubtfulness. Okay, so religious people are aware of how irreligious people view them. And when they see things, again, all these things that I mentioned, from the Holocaust to sick babies, etc., or just the suffering and death of good people, they do wonder, are these people right about me? Am I, these people that think, these irreligious people who think I'm delusional, are they right? Okay. Am I a sucker? Am I a fool? When in fact the world is godless. Okay. Do you need to take that?
Yeah, 1 second. Give me
Sure.
one. Sorry.
Let me make this point this way. If you think of courage and fearless, like what's the difference between courage and fearlessness?
Suppose if you go through the Socratic dialogues, if you're fearless, you're not really courageous. In order to be courageous, you need to experience fear and overcome it.
Exactly. Okay, so fearlessness is not having fear, whereas courage means overcoming fear. Okay? By the same token, faith, religious faith, is not the same as conviction. Okay? Faith doesn't mean that you don't have doubts, but rather it means that you overcome doubts. Okay? Because the man of faith is constantly assaulted by doubt, because he constantly sees either injustice in the world or inscrutable things, or things that don't make sense in if you think that the world is governed by some sort of divine system of justice, etc., etc., then you see all sorts of things that you don't understand. It shakes it assaults your faith, and it sows doubt, and people of faith overcome that doubt in whichever mechanisms, doesn't matter now. Okay, so when we read the Abraham story, like basically, I want you to, as you read the Abraham story, to read it with this predicament of the man of faith in mind. Okay, so Abraham, is having a relationship with God, and this. I guess my point is that this element of doubt is built into a relationship with God, whether it's Abraham or somebody today. Okay? So as you read the Abraham story, read it with this issue with this predicament in mind, with this doubt. And think of the fact that in their first conversation, God told Abraham to do this insane thing, leave his land, leave his family, etc., etc., and in return, God promises to give Abraham land and family and progeny, etc. Okay? Abraham does everything that God tells him to do, and does it immediately, but he does not receive anything that God had promised. Okay? We see Abraham wandering in Canaan and going to Egypt and back and for years. Okay, and so look, actually in that trip to Egypt and back, and then to Goa and back, you see that he has no home, no land, no wealth. Okay, he is traveling to Egypt because of famine in the land of Canaan. He doesn't, he's poor. So he's got no home, no land, no wealth, and no family. His wife is barren for decades, till she's 90. Okay? So do you think that Abraham is racked with doubt about his decision to listen to that voice in his head? Do you think that Abraham is wondering whether he ruined his life and his wife's life by going on this crazy adventure because some voice in his head told him to do so? Of course. I mean, of course he's wondering. Okay? And these chapters that we're now entering into show you, I mean, again, this is not me. This is the author telling you explicitly, and sometimes Abraham telling you explicitly in his own word that he's wondering, that he's doubting. Okay, so let's see. Okay, we've covered the first conversation between God and Abraham. So let's move to the next 6. Okay. So in the so this is the second conversation with God comes in that episode where Abraham gives his wife to Pharaoh when they go to Egypt. Okay. So how do you make sense of this weird and shameful story that comes next about Abraham and Sarah and Pharaoh? Like, well, why does Abraham do this?
It would seem that the understanding is that because Sarah is very beautiful, that Pharaoh is going to want her, and if to get her means to kill Abraham, he won't hesitate. Whereas if to get her means to perhaps in another way curry favor with Abraham because he's her brother, he would be able to survive that way.
Right.
But in Egypt, because she's very beautiful, Pharaoh is going to end up in possession of
he will
Sarah no matter what.
Yeah, he will have her one way or the other. Right. And so better there pretend to be her brother in that way, Bill. So if you're right, okay, but if you keep in mind or keep your mind trained on the fact that this is a story, or if you keep your mind on the fact that the Abraham story is a story about Abraham's relationship with God. Okay, what does this story reveal about his inner thoughts and about his thoughts about his relationship with God?
So the reason that he went down to Egypt and ended up in the first place is because he followed God to a land where there was famine and he was going to die. So I think he'd be questioning whether God's going to come through.
Right. He is afraid that Pharaoh will kill him. He was afraid that the drought would kill him. Okay, that's why he went to Egypt. Now he's afraid that Pharaoh will kill him. That's why he's devising some other solution. I'll pretend to be her brother, etc. The point is, it reveals that he does not trust God's promise. God's protection, God's promise of protection and providence. Okay. Look, God promised him children from this woman. If he trusted God to come through, he would trust in God's protection, but he clearly does not. Okay. And so following, again, if you look at episode 13, verse 14 to 17. Wait, 13. Yeah.
And the Lord said to Abraham.
Wait, this. Sorry. 13. Where is this?
Yeah.
No, this is. Where is it? Okay, yeah. Sorry, it was so 13 verse. 14.
So I have, and the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, raise your eyes and look out from where you are to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, for I give you all the land that you see, and your offspring forever, into your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as dust on the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring too can be counted.
Yeah. And then he says, get up and walk through this land, length and width, because I will give this land to you. Okay? So basically, so following this weird Egyptian episode, God speaks to Abraham a second time and re-promises him in a more detailed way exactly what he promised him in the first conversation. I will give you land and progeny. Okay, so why is God having this conversation with him? Why promise him what he already promised him? Okay, what happened that would make God speak to Abraham and re-promise him what he promised?
So if we go to the last time, there was a time before he went to Egypt where Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will assign thee the land of your offspring, and then Abraham built an altar there, and then he moved there from the country in Bethel, pitched his tent, and he built an altar and invoked the name of the Lord Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, but nothing happened. And then he sojourned in Egypt, and then he had to do this episode where, I don't know, he had
I don't know if he had to, but he chose to give his wife to Pharaoh. Okay.
Right, where he was in that situation, and then he gets out of that situation, and then it seems like it's unclear whether and to what degree Abraham is going to have to sacrifice himself and his family in order for this promise to come to fruition. Because if there's constant famines that he has to endure, if there's constant situations where he's forced into a situation where he feels like he needs to give his wife to Pharaoh.
Right. So look, when you're looking at this text, Abraham and Lot returned to Canaan loaded with gold and silver and livestock that Pharaoh had given Abraham for Sarah. And then Lot and Abraham separate, and then God speaks to Abraham and promises him, again, everything that he's already promised him before. Okay, so as you can imagine, God doesn't do things just on a whim. Okay, he certainly doesn't speak to humans just because he wants to catch up and shoot the breeze. So what is this speech by God? What is God doing here in relation to this whole Egypt episode?
He's reaffirming the covenant that he had already made with Abraham. But then the question arises, was this Egypt episode, why did that happen?
Well,
why was it necessary? Like, why is that part of the story?
Well, it happened because Abram chose to go to Egypt because he was afraid that he was going to die in Canaan.
Right, but there was a famine, and then he called out to the Lord, and nothing happened, and then he journeyed.
Right. Yeah. So
the Lord's not necessarily going to come through in times of famine.
Well, that's certainly what Abram thought. Okay, and the Lord isn't going to come through when a king wants my wife. The wife that God promised will carry my seed. Okay, so look, you're right to notice that Abraham is afraid. Okay, and that, you've noticed it, God noticed it. Well, Abram knows it. You could see it. Abraham's afraid, and God notices it. Okay, so God, after this shameful episode in Egypt, God reveals himself or speaks to Abraham and tells him, dude, I know you're afraid because I saw you leaving the land that I promised would provide for you. I saw you give your wife to Pharaoh, the wife whose womb I told you would produce your progeny. Okay, you gave her and her womb to Pharaoh. Okay, so I know that you're afraid that I won't protect you and won't provide for you with all the wealth and land and family that I had promised. Okay? But look at what happened. Your fears proved false. I was with you. I did protect you. I protected Sarah. I protected Sarah's womb. I made sure that Pharaoh won't molest her and again won't contaminate, won't. I protected her womb for you. Okay? And I provided you with all this wealth. So don't be afraid. I, God, the God of the universe, am coming to talk to you to remind you that I am with you. I am protecting you. I am providing for you. I'm a man of my word. I will live up to my promise, which I am therefore reiterating here for you. Okay, so what he's saying is, I know that you think I've left you. I haven't left you. I'm still with you. Look at what happened to you. Look at how you're coming back from Egypt, a rich man. Okay? Look at how I protected your wife.
Why didn't he come through from in Bethel when he invoked the name of the Lord?
Well, yeah, maybe God doesn't think that Abraham is his master, that he should show up when Abraham summons him. Okay? Maybe he wanted to see whether Abram would have faith without God showing up for him. But this, the point is that everyone reading this story understands that Abraham was afraid. Okay? He said he was afraid that Pharaoh would kill him, and therefore he gave his wife to another man. Okay? And so God, just like we do, God understands what Abram is going through, that he's doubting. Because look, this voice appeared to him once, and Abram did all these crazy things, and the voice disappeared. So the voice is coming back and saying, don't think you're crazy. Don't think that it's just some voice that you heard. I really am God. I did protect you in Egypt. I protected Sarah's womb. I'm providing for you all this wealth. You know, I punished Pharaoh so that he provided you all this wealth and everything else. So so I haven't left you. I haven't abandoned you. I'm caring for you. Don't be afraid. Believe in me and stop being such a chicken. Believe in me so that you won't end up dishonoring your wife again or threatening your progeny, etc.
But does God pass judgment on what he did in Egypt?
Well, I mean, the fact that that God took an active role in preventing Abraham's scheme from working.
But then Abraham comes around and does the exact same thing again with the
yeah. That's true. Okay, and we'll look at that episode in a second. Okay, look, the point is, if you're listening to Borgman, is that Abraham is undergoing some sort of a process. The relationship between the two of them is developing. It's not static. Okay? And that's why Borgman understands the end at Mount Moriah, you know, with Isaac, as the culmination of a long process through 7 conversations, through 7 encounters. Okay? The first encounter is a voice, and Abraham basically jumps off the bridge. And where's the voice? Where's the family? Where's the wealth? Where's the land? Here he left the land. You know, clearly he doesn't. He's afraid. He's afraid that he is just hearing voices. That God is not providing him land, is not protecting him, not providing wealth. He left for Egypt as a homeless guy, basically.
And he was, not only did he leave and nothing positive came to him, but he ended up in a land where there's a famine. So there was a negative,
Yeah.
not only was there nothing provided for him, but something was taken from his situation.
Exactly. And again, think of what we were talking about, the predicament of the man of faith. Okay, every religious person experiences things all the time that suggest to him that he's a chump. You're believing a false belief. Look at the world. Yeah, you had a baby born, it died. Okay, you're a good person, you went bankrupt. Okay, you tried to help a man on the street, he spit in your face, or I don't know, whatever. So Abraham made a leap of faith, didn't ask for a miracle, made a leap of faith, and had nothing to show for it. And that's why he's leaving for Egypt, that's why he's giving up his wife and everything else. And so God is showing up here and saying, I see what's happening. I know you're afraid. I can see that you're afraid. Look, you and I just read this book. We can see, anyone can see that he's afraid. Abraham says that he's afraid. He tells Sarah, I'm afraid that Pharaoh will kill me. He doesn't trust in God's promise of protection, providence, etc. And that's why God is showing up and saying, I know you're afraid. Don't be afraid. I am with you. Look at how I protected you in Egypt. Look at the wealth you provided. And here I am promising you the promise again. So believe in me. Stop being afraid. Believe. Don't be afraid. Okay? And we can see that this is indeed the meaning of this conversation in the next conversation between God and Abram, if you skip to the War of the Four Kings. Okay? In Genesis 15. Okay? So this really is an amazing chapter, because when you look at this third conversation, what's the what do you see here in the third? What's remarkable here? What's new here in the third conversation?
So I'm at 4.
This is
15, 4.
15 verse 1.
Okay.
Okay, so this is after the War of the Four Kings.
Mm-hmm. So it says, fear not, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God.
So first of all, fear not. Fear not. Don't be afraid. Okay. But go ahead. What else? So what? Actually, you skipped over a very important part.
He said, at least I have, fear not, Abram, I am a shield to you.
You already skipped over it. You already skipped.
Sometime later, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He said, fear not.
Okay. In a vision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is the first. This is the first encounter where where Abraham isn't just hearing the voice of God, he sees with his eyes some sort of vision. Okay. What else? Okay, so first, it involves two senses rather than just one, but also, what else? What else is again? So there's what I was telling you is that I can show you that God is concerned. God notices in his concern and is trying to not alleviate, but alleviate Abraham's fear. Okay? He says, "Fear not. Don't be afraid. I told you. I noticed what's going on in the previous conversation. I tried to assuage, not alleviate. Assuage your fear. Here it's explicit. Don't be afraid." Okay, And just in case you think you're hearing voices, here, I'm revealing myself in a vision as well. What else is new here compared to the... So these two are new things compared to the previous conversations. What else is different in this conversation compared to the previous two?
He explicitly says he will shield him.
That's true. That's true. That's true. So again, it goes with the fear not, but you're right.
And then he tells him that his reward, he doesn't talk about the dust of the earth or his progeny, but he just says his reward will be very great.
Yeah. And then how about verses 2 and 3?
But Abram said, O Lord God, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless? And the one in charge of my household, Damascus Eliezer.
It's Damascus Eliezer of Damascus. That's the servant, Abraham's slave that he later on will send to pick up a wife for Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
So Eliezer of Damascus.
Abram said further, since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir.
Yeah. Okay. So he says, what can you give me? Or, Eliezer is my, I'm childless, and my slave will inherit me because you have given me no seed. So look,
that he doesn't believe that God's going to follow through.
Oh yeah, no, look, that we already know. We already found that beforehand. Okay, but this is the first time it's a conversation. Okay, so up until now, God spoke and Abraham listened. In the first two conversations. Okay, in the first two conversations, God spoke, no vision. And third, God is explicit here about the don't be afraid. Okay, what we could only read into it in the second conversation, given the context of when God appears to him and repromises him and again assuages his fear, here God is explicit about it. Okay, so if this conversation, if this third conversation took place after Abram's shameful performance in Egypt, again giving his wife to another man, then it would be understandable why God would start with, don't be afraid. Okay? Because that certainly was a scene in which Abraham did display fear. Okay? But what happened here? This conversation happens when? What happened just before this third conversation with God?
The wars with the 5 kings.
4. Yeah, and how did Abram acquit himself in this affair?
He allied with the Canaanites and pushed the Babylonians north.
Right, he was
and won.
Yeah, he's a complete badass.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is Abram at his most fearless. He takes on 4 local kings or chieftains, doesn't matter, rulers of local kingdoms in the area, without hesitation, without fear, purely out of family, kind of familial duty to his nephew Lot. Okay, again, remember these 4 kings or chieftains didn't harm or threaten Abram at all. Okay, he takes all of them on. He's fearless. He kicks butt, takes names, conducts himself honorably before, during, and after the war. Okay, so why on earth is God, after this, why is God showing up and talking about Abram being afraid? Like, why on earth is God starting his speech with, again, Abram, the victorious hero, completely dominated, just, without fear. Why is God after this showing up and says, don't be afraid? Like, again, we'd understand the speech here if this speech didn't come here but came after Egypt, where Abram really was scared. And so what's the connection here between what just happened in the war and God's revelation and conversation with Abram?
I mean, he did well in the war, but that doesn't mean that he didn't just provoke a whole bunch of tribes that might come back after him. And this is the first time, I guess, real hostility, like war happens.
Yeah, that's a good point. Look, so people have pointed out correctly that Abram conquers with his own might the land from Sodom, from the Dead Sea, all the way to Damascus. Okay, so basically Abram establishes a claim by right of conquest to the land of Israel, which his descendants will later on come back to claim under Joshua. Okay, so it makes sense that in this respect, in this historic respect, it makes sense that God in this third meeting would again repeat or re-repeat the promise that all this land belongs to you and will belong to your descendants. Okay, but it doesn't explain. So the promise of the land makes sense in this respect of this is the scene where Abram establishes possession or kind of a right to the land for his descendants hundreds of years later. But it doesn't explain why God is starting the speech with, don't be afraid, Abram. I'm protecting you and I will reward you. Because, again, Abraham is not in a position of weakness and he's rewarded himself. He's taken all this land and all these possessions. So, so it might be, as you say, that, hey, you've just won a number of enemies. Don't be afraid. Okay.
Well, even he allied with the Canaanite kings, but he didn't. Nobody was wiped out.
Yeah.
Like they're all still.
Yeah. So it might be. So you're right that it might be a something for the future. Okay. You've just won yourself a number of enemies who might want to come and get you back, and so don't be afraid. I'm with you, and I'll reward you. Okay. But the point is, it's clear that God is not referring to anything that happened in the preceding episode, because nothing that Abraham did in the war would justify this assurance. We don't see Abraham afraid. Okay, so it might be referring to something in the future, as you suggest. And the thing is, look, a lot of people have been perplexed by this. Okay, because again, anyone reading this would be perplexed. Well, what is God talking about? What afraid? Abraham, again, just showed himself to be the baddest man in the neighborhood. Everyone's afraid of him. He's not afraid of them. Okay, so instead of us speculating,
is it that his land's going to go to Eliezer, who's from Damascus, who is in Damascus north?
Oh,
so
no.
His land would be going to the north?
No.
Like the people who inherit all of his possessions?
No, Eliezer is already in his household. He's his slave, his servant. It's just that he is Eliezer of Damascus. That's his origin. Okay, but you're right. We don't need to wonder Okay, what God is talking about. What fear? Okay, is it the fear of the future that these 4 kings will come back and get him? Because look, God doesn't reassure him, that I'll protect you from these kings. God is addressing Abraham's real fears, which Abraham tells you in the very next sentence. Okay, in verse 1, God says, "Don't worry, fear not, Abram. I am protecting you, and I will reward you very much." And Abraham says, as you read earlier, okay, that I'm afraid that you are not coming through on your promise. You promised me a family. You promised me land and wealth and everything else. And his concern, again, is not that he doesn't have money or doesn't have land or anything else, but I am childless. I'm already an old man, and the person who will inherit me is my slave, because I don't have any children. Okay, so when God says, starts his third speech to, again, conversations between God and human beings are a big deal. Okay, again, God doesn't just come and chat. There's something here that God wants to address, just like he wanted to address Abraham's fear following the Pharaoh episode. When God says, "Don't be afraid," we readers are perplexed, because we just read about this war, and Abraham was not afraid at all. Okay, so we're perplexed about what's God talking about. But Abram knows exactly what God's talking about. God knows, and Abram knows, what's been eating at Abram for years now. Okay, I came to this land like you told me. You promised me seed, but I don't even have a single child, let alone children as numerous as the stars. Okay, you promised me many children, a huge family, as plentiful as the sand on the beach. Okay, and look at me, I'm a joke. Okay? I'm a laughing stock, believing in some voice in my head. Okay? So I am afraid. I mean, again, Abram says it here in his own words. I'm not afraid of the 4 kings. I'm afraid that I threw away everything because foolish me, I trusted that you are really God rather than some delusion. And now I'm going to die a loser with my slave Eliezer inheriting me rather than a son, which is what this whole thing was about. I came here because you promised me a large family. I don't even have a small family. Okay, so look, and you can sense the bitterness in verse 3. You did not give me seed. Okay? In Abram's mind, it is now more likely that he's crazy. Again, in that process of wondering, am I crazy or is this really God? Okay? The I'm crazy is winning. It's more likely in Abraham's mind that he's crazy than that this really is God. Okay? And this explains why God doesn't simply speak to Abram's ear like in the previous 2 conversations. He also reveals himself to Abram's eye. And why he doesn't simply speak to Abram, but also listens and replies. Okay, he's signaling, he's trying to reassure Abram, you're not imagining things, I am real. Okay, this is not just a voice you're hearing, it's reciprocal. I can hear you and respond to you. You can see me, not just hear me. Okay, so if you this Abram knows that this is not this conversation has nothing to do with the war of the four kings. In the fear not, I'm sorry, that the fear not has nothing to do with the four kings, unlike the previous conversation where Abram really did show fear in Egypt. Okay? This third conversation is connected to the war in that God is telling Abram, look at this. I protected you. I gave you this victory. I gave you all this land you've campaigned in, you've fought in, from Judea to Syria. Okay, this is your land, and I will preserve it for your descendants. Okay, but so in that respect, it follows the War of the Four Kings, and it's related to it. Okay? I provide you this victory, and here, you came back. I promised you wealth, land, family. Okay, you came back from Egypt with wealth. Now you have land. You conquered all this land, and I will preserve this land for your descendants. And what he's addressing is what God is. The reason why God is coming to speak with Abraham is because of that, again, that predicament of the man of faith. Repeated doubt and repeated fear that maybe I am delusional. Repeated fear that maybe all these people who are mocking me for being crazy, maybe they're right and I am crazy. Okay? And so, but again, read here. So Abraham gets another speech from God, and he gets a vision, and he gets a conversation. But Abram is not satisfied. Hearing is not enough, seeing is not enough, conversing is not enough. Okay? So he says, you didn't give me a son, I'm going to die childless and everything else. God takes him outside and tells him to look, to count at the stars and everything else. And again, promises him again a huge progeny. Believe in God. He tells him, believe in me. I gave you that. And then look at verse, where is it? Yeah. So how does, so he tells him, God tells him whatever he tells him. Again, promises him and everything else. And then what does Abram?
Generation.
How do you know that Abram is not satisfied? That he doesn't believe this promise? Like, I've heard this promise before. How do you know that Abram is not buying it? In verse 8.
He said, "O Lord, how shall I know that I will possess it?" He answered, "Bring me for your word."
That's it. Verse 9 is already God responding to him. Look, God just humbled himself to Abraham. He came down to again speak to Abraham. He's listening to Abraham. He's responding to Abraham. He's revealing himself in a vision to Abraham. And he promises him, I will provide you all this and your children and the land and everything else. And Abram says, how will I know? How can I know that I will indeed inherit it? Like, I understand that you're promising me. How will I know that this promise is legitimate? Look, when I asked you, what would you do if God spoke to you and told you to jump off a bridge or to sell your house and give away all your earthly possessions to the poor? And you said, look, I'd ask for a miracle. I need to know, before I do this insane thing, if this is really God, in which case I'll do it, or if I'm going crazy, in which case I'm not going to do it, and instead I'm going to check myself into a hospital. Okay? So Abraham is now for the third time hearing this promise. He's still childless. And therefore he asks, he's not satisfied with the vision, with the voice, and he says, I want a miracle. How will I know that this promise will come true? Okay, so and so he asks for a miracle, just like you and I would, and God accommodates him. He conducts this miracle with the covenant of the pieces. You know, again, if you read the next verses, you see, you know, darkness in the middle of the day, a column of smoke and a column of fire passing between these carcasses that Abraham cut into. Okay, that's, you know, you ask for a miracle, do this and see this light show. Amazing thing. By the way, apparently this kind of ceremony where you split animals and walk through, walk in between the separated parts of the animals, was a ceremony that kings would perform when establishing an alliance with someone, or when kings conducted an alliance or struck an alliance. This is what they do. Okay, so it was an ancient Near Eastern diplomatic ritual. Okay. So it, and again, it's called the covenant or the alliance of the pieces. Okay, so God is striking an alliance, covenant with Abraham. Okay, and again, it says here in 18, verse 18, on that day, God formed an alliance or a pact or covenant with Abram. Okay, promising to his progeny this land. Okay, promising that Abram's seed, Abram's progeny, will replace the 10 peoples, the 10 nations of Canaan, which are then listed in verses 19 to 21.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So,
oh, go ahead. Sorry, what?
No, just all the Kenites, the Jebusites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim.
Yeah. The Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites. Okay, so Abram demands a miracle, and God provides a miracle in the form of this alliance that he establishes with Abraham. Holy smokes! It's almost 3:30. So let's skip over the Hagar story for now, since we're following the Abraham story, the God Abram story. Okay, so I don't want to go too long, so we might break and continue next week. But okay, so we'll return to Hagar later on. So we're now in Genesis 17. Okay. So again, we're now in the fourth and fifth conversations. This is promising Isaac and naming Isaac. And promising Isaac and the circumcision. Okay. So out of nowhere, in chapter 17, God appears again visually for added convincibility. So God appears to Abraham and tells him again about their alliance, and again promises him what he had already promised before. plus he changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarah's name to Sarai's name to Sarah. So basically, so God adds part of his own name, the H, to their names. So he repeats. So we have here in the fourth conversation a repeat of the previous promises, but God adds a demand that Abram circumcise all the men and the boys in his household, and forevermore that Abram's descendants would do that as well. Okay, so God doesn't simply reiterate his commitment to Abram, but further cements their alliance by having, that Abram and his household and his offspring will bear a physical mark on their bodies, marking them as God's people. And Abraham and Sarah will have God's name imprinted on their names. Okay, so basically, God is branding this family. God is putting his name on their names, and he's putting his mark on their flesh. Okay, God is putting his brand on their name and putting his brand on their skin. Okay? But why does this conversation happen? Why does God all of a sudden, out of the blue, come to talk with Abram to re-promise him a promise that he already made, and to renew an alliance that he already made with him?
Because at this point, Abraham had to say goodbye to Hagar and Ishmael just before this episode. And he still didn't have,
Yeah, actually that's a good point. I didn't even think of that, but you're absolutely right. I was thinking of, again, this conversation happens in verse 1 of chapter 17, verse 1. Okay? And God revealed himself to Abraham and told him, but verse 1 starts with, and Abraham was 99 years old. Okay? So we don't have to kind of wonder why is God appearing to Abraham. When you combine what you said, that Abraham had a son, he had Ishmael, and he had to, and God, instructed him to say goodbye to him. Wait a second. No, actually, no. I take it back. No, Ishmael isn't. Okay, yeah, okay. So no. Abraham doesn't say goodbye to Ishmael.
Sarah has that confrontation with.
Yeah. It's just Hagar runs away and comes back. So so nothing happens. Okay, Hagar runs away and comes back. That's not some sort of earth-shattering event for Abraham. Look, so the text tells you why God.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Is appearing, because Abraham is 99 years old.
Okay.
Okay, God is coming to talk with Abraham because, of course, Abraham feels like a fool. He's turning 100. He's married to a 90-year-old, to an old lady, and he's still waiting for his first son. Years and years after God had promised him numerous offspring. It's been about actually, and we now understand where the chapter tells us. Where is it? If you see the last verse of the previous chapter, tells us that Abraham is 86 years old when Ishmael was born. He is now 99 years old. Okay, 13 years have passed. Okay, so so it's been at least 13 years. We don't know exactly when the covenant of the pieces was, but it's been at least 13 years since God last reiterated his promise to Abraham about offspring, about numerous offspring. Okay, so Abraham, again, and the promise was from Sarah. Okay, so Abraham clearly feels that he's being made a fool of. Not that, he either fears that God has forgotten him, that God is not true to his word, or he fears that God is not God, that God is just a voice in his head. And here comes God on Abraham's 99th birthday to allay these fears. Okay, so again, I just want to clarify that this is not me reading things into it.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you know that that this is Abram's concern?
He emphasizes his age.
Who?
Abram, or I guess it was I was must I work my ways and blameless.
Look, so God says in verse 2 to 4, God says, I'll give you many offspring, and Abram falls to the ground. At which point, God repeats the promise at length.
Yeah.
You'll do this, and again, and now he changes their name and instructs him about the circumcision. And then again, Abram falls on his face and laughs at what God just said. Okay, so Abram. So again, this is not me kind of telling you, hey, I can see through some sort of insight into the story that God is appearing because Abram's afraid, that Abram feels like a fool, that Abram feels that this is baloney. Okay, again, we saw before that Abraham feels this way because he asked for a sign, for a miracle. And we see again here, we don't have to be some sort of, to see things under the surface. Abraham tells us in verse, was it 17. Or again, he doesn't say, he's laughing silently at this ridiculous promise that he will have sons from this ancient woman that he's living with. Okay, he says in his heart, Abraham says in his heart that this cannot be. Okay. And he tells God, no, Ishmael will inherit me. Okay. Abram does not believe God.
Yep.
Okay? He's laughing at this ridiculous promise, and when God repeats the promise, Abram says, no, I've fallen for that baloney before. Ishmael will inherit me. At which point God repeats the promise about Sarah. Okay, and throughout this conversation with Abraham, God hammers on this issue of progeny. Again, read all the verses between 4 and or 3 and here, and what is it? Well, throughout the episode.
Abram threw himself on his face, and God spoke to him further. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the father of a multitude of nations, and you shall no longer be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I make you a father of the multitude of nations. I will make.
It's just again all through verses through 8, 9, 10, up until the circumcision instructions. He talks about many multitudes of progeny, repeatedly, and then again. after he tells them that no, Ishmael will inherit me, he says, God, in 21, okay, no, you will be the one. I'm sorry, Isaac will be the one. I will give you a son through Sarah. His name will be Isaac. Okay, so God, again, the issue that Abraham has, which he complains about, is progeny. And the issue that God addresses is progeny, repeatedly.
Mhm.
Okay? And God returns to it time and time again through this conversation, more so than in their previous conversations. So what does this chapter tell you about Abram's relationship with God? Like, has it progressed, regressed, stayed the same?
It seems like it stayed the same. He still didn't trust that God's going to come through.
Right. We see that Abraham doubts God, and that God knows this and reiterates that old promise, none of which has come true yet. Okay? We see God making a new demand on Abraham, and Abraham complying with the circumcision. But if Abraham doubted God's fidelity to him, to Abraham, before this conversation, nothing happened to make Abraham less doubtful. Yeah? Yet another promise from God. Big whoop. Okay? He complies with God's instruction yet again. He always does. Abraham always does. But we see no reason for Abraham to become more assured than he was beforehand that God really will come through. Okay? This is not the first time that Abraham heard the voice or saw the image or heard this promise. And then, and let's finish with this next conversation. In chapter 18, immediately after this episode, we have yet another encounter with God about the same exact thing, about not getting the son he was promised. Okay, chapter 18. Okay, so again, this just ended,
Mm-hmm.
and the next episode is, again, the angels come to his tent,
Mm-hmm.
and God again predicts that he will come back a year hence, and Sarah, at 91 years old, will be holding a newborn baby. Okay, so just again, God promises. Abraham and Sarah have heard this ridiculous promise before, so it makes no bigger impression on them now. And Sarah laughs at this. Sarah laughs at this promise, just as Abraham laughed at the promise when he heard it in the previous chapter, in the fourth encounter with God. Okay, and we readers are reminded in verse 11.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just in case we forgot. Okay, that they both laugh at God's promise. They're both very, we understand why both of them laughed at God's promise, because they're both very, very, very old. And the text then goes out of its way, because look, maybe Sarah is this unique woman who's still vibrant in her womanhood at 91, and so this verse 11 tells us they laughed because Abraham and Sarah are very old, and Sarah no longer gets her period. Okay, so she no longer ovulates. Okay, this is it for her. She cannot have children. That's why they're laughing. That's why they don't believe this promise. Okay, so the text clarifies that it would be a literal miracle if she conceives. Yeah, that this promise is insane. And of course they don't believe it. And then these fellows leave for Sodom, and Abram has that bargaining with God about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and we'll skip that and go on to the sixth conversation. Actually, we should probably call it a day here, huh? It's been a long... Do you have another 10 minutes, or should we just pick this up next?
Oh, I got 10 minutes.
Yeah? Okay. So, just quickly, before we go to the sixth conversation, just as since we have the angels here, I just want to, this is going to be important in future encounters with angels. First, like we talked in the creation story, when we talked about why God is in the plural, angels in the Torah are not heavenly creatures. Okay? Angels are messengers, either messengers from God or messengers from people. Okay? So when somebody sends an angel, like when I send an angel to you, it's simply a messenger. Okay, that's how it is in Hebrew, and that's how it is in ancient Greek. Angelos is simply a messenger. There's no suggestion that it's a divine creature. So these angels that appear to Abraham are either real people, real flesh and blood, sent by God to his house, or maybe there's some sort of vision, like some sort of, again, like God can make a plume of smoke appear or fire. He can make an avatar appear in human form. And in fact, if you notice, at the beginning of chapter 18, they're not called angels; they're called people. Okay, we're told in 18 in verse 1 that God showed Himself to Abraham, and then immediately in verse 2 we're told that three people come to visit Abraham. Okay, so they make their prediction about Sarah, and then they head off for Sodom in 22. But at that point it says Abraham remained there with God. And that's when he starts this negotiation with God about the fate of Sodom, and what if there's one righteous man that we can save it? So, and then after this negotiation, it says in verse 33, God departs and Abraham returns to his tent. However, if you jump to the beginning of the next, to chapter 19, verse 1, it tells us that the angels, now they're called angels, arrive at Sodom and meet Lot. Okay, so to Abraham, they appeared as they're described to us as people. When they arrive in Sodom, there are two problems. Well, it's not a problem. Number one, we now know that they're angels of God, that they're messengers from God. But also, there are only two now arriving at Lot's place. Okay, so what's happening here? There are three who came to Abraham, and only two come to Lot.
Is the other one back talking to Abraham through God, or God through the messenger to Abraham?
The Bible goes out of its way to create a math problem for us. Okay, so and actually, for those of us who can't do math well, the Bible recreates the problem in words rather than number. Because God, singular, shows Himself to Abraham, but people, in the plural, visit. And the people say, the people, again, these visitors, say some things in the plural tense, and other things in their conversation with Abraham are said in the singular. Again, it's harder to understand in English, because in English it's the same word, whether it's plural people speaking versus one. It's the same. I play, we play. It's the same verb. But in Hebrew, the verb, there's an addition. It sounds one way if it's singular, and there's an addition if it's plural. And so some of the things that are said by the people are said in the plural, and some are said in the singular. So in any case, so the text at that point says that the people left for Sodom, but God remained behind with Abraham, and that only 2 angels or messengers arrive at Sodom. Okay, so it seems to me that the Bible here wants to show us that actually one of those 3 men was not a man, but a human avatar of God. Okay, and Abraham didn't catch on that this was God early in the interaction, but he gets it. But he does get it at some point during the visit. Okay, so it's not. I mean, it might be important, but it's a reminder of how carefully we need to read the Torah, because the author clearly creates all sorts of puzzles for us to notice and to solve. This is not a simple narration of story. The author creates problems, and then we're supposed to somehow solve the math problem. Okay, so let's call it a day and continue next week. And just yes,
We're going to go start at 19.
Yes, read chapters 20 to 23, or through 23, but taking into account what we've discussed today about the predicament of the man of faith, because again, we'll have an exact, in the 6th conversation, we'll have an exact replay of the story of Abraham pimping out his wife, as he did in Egypt. Okay, it's an exact, seemingly a repeat. Okay, and so just consider what's the function of that story. How is it different from the first time around in Egypt? And then the story of the binding of Isaac, and again, just read slowly and carefully to see if you can find, again, these messages by the biblical, by the author in this continuing storyline about the relationship, about God promising, and Abraham's faith problem. Okay? All right. I'll see you next week.
Thanks again for everything.
Sure thing. Till then.
Have a good weekend.
Sorry for going so long today.
No, this is great. Thank you.
Adios.